today we have Mike Sainsbury. He specializes in genetic genealogy to identify unknown ancestors. He has solved or significantly narrowed the pool of candidates in several cases, including with adoptees and undocumented parents and grandparents. So we want to welcome him and take it away.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And thanks everyone for joining today's webinar on identifying unknown parents or grandparents through DNA. My name is Mike Sainsbury, and I'm a librarian turned genealogist. My company is called DFH DNA Family Health. The DFH stands for DNA Family Health, and my specialty is using DNA to help answer family questions. I'm glad I could be here today to present this topic and answer your questions. Before we get started, I should say that much of this presentation will be geared toward people who've already taken a DNA test, like on Ancestry or MyHeritage. But if you're unfamiliar with all this, the information will still be useful. So I've been using DNA in my family history research for the past 5 years. I also use these skills to help others find unknown ancestors. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. In particular, I want to introduce 3 techniques that will help you identify an unknown parent or grandparent using DNA. Those techniques are listed on this slide, and they are, number 1, using all available websites. And I'll explain the why and the how of that as we go through this. Number 2 is doing something called clustering your matches and building their family trees. And then the 3rd technique is simply rolling up your sleeves and theorizing immediately in your search for an unknown ancestor. Now, I should say at the start that because the presentation is called Identifying Unknown Parents or Grandparents through DNA, I'm not assuming that you yourself are looking for a parent or a grandparent. It may be that you're helping someone who's on a search like this. So if you're the person seeking an unknown parent or grandparent, it will be your DNA test that's being used to get the ball rolling. And if you're helping someone else, of course, it would be that other person's. So sometimes in this presentation, I'll talk about your DNA or your DNA test. But of course, I mean the DNA or the DNA test of the person who's seeking a biological parent or grandparent. Which brings me to the first part of this presentation, which includes 3 foundations that you'll need in order to use DNA in a search like this. Those foundations are, number 1, the process of DNA inheritance, because how that works has a lot of impact on how we search and how we interpret our DNA results. Number 2 is the concept of genetic cousins and most recent common ancestors. So those are 2 groups of people that are going to be very important to us as we're looking for an unknown parent or grandparent, because our genetic cousins and their family trees and the ancestors that make them related to each other are how we'll uncover the unknown parent or grandparent that we're looking for. And then finally, number 3, I'll talk about how and why to be systematic and not get overwhelmed by all the steps and all the technical jargon and what is sometimes all the work required to do a search like this. So DNA can sometimes, right from the start, seem incredibly overwhelming. If you've done a DNA test and you've got this match list, and then that kind of as far as you get and you don't know what to do with it. So that's what we're looking at today, is what do I do with it and how do I do that work? Okay, so before we learn how to search for an unknown parent or grandparent, let's start with those foundations. The first foundation is an understanding of DNA. And in particular, I'm talking about what's called autosomal DNA. And that type of DNA can be inherited from any of our many ancestors. DNA has been called the building block of life. It tells our cells how to develop and what to do. Most importantly for family history research are 3 things. The first is We inherit our DNA from our parents. In particular, one side of our DNA is inherited from our mother, and the other side is inherited from our father. This means in the search for an unknown parent or grandparent, you can really focus on the side of your DNA that was inherited from the unknown parent or grandparent. So anyone you identify in your match list who shares DNA with you on the other side of your family, they can basically be ignored. So we'll look at that more closely a bit later, but it means right away, basically 50% of your matches you can kind of set aside in the search for an unknown parent or grandparent. And another important point about DNA is that it's randomly inherited through your parents from many ancestors. Everyone inherits DNA, but it's the exact pattern of our DNA that we inherit from our unique set of ancestors. When you take a DNA test, what's happening is the test examines the patterns in your DNA, and then it looks for other test takers who have the exact same patterns at specific points. Those matching segments are what we're focused on when we use DNA to find unknown parents or grandparents. Another point about DNA is that in most cases, people who have identical segments of DNA inherited that DNA from the same ancestor. So we might not know exactly how they're related to us on a family tree, but the fact that those matches inherited those identical segments of DNA from an ancestor that we share with them is one of the keys to all this. Those people, those matches are our genetic cousins, and the ancestors we share with them become very important in the search for an unknown parent or grandparent. And then the last thing you need to know about DNA is that it's measured in something called centimorgans. So the picture shows you or your DNA on the left, and it's a representation of a strand of DNA with the two sides that I mentioned, mother's and father's side. And you can see one side is grayed out, and the other side is labeled with two segments. One is 12 centimorgans, and the other is 14 centimorgans in size. And on the right-hand side of this diagram is someone who has the same DNA pattern along two segments. They exactly match the pattern in your DNA at the same 2 points. So in this diagram, you and your match share a total of 26 centimorgans, 12 plus 14, across two segments. In terms of centimorgans and the size of matches, when you're looking for an unknown parent or grandparent, matches above, let's say, 200 centimorgans are very, very good and will be very helpful. If your matches are all below that threshold, it does become more difficult to use DNA to find an unknown parent or grandparent. So I just want to flag that as a bit of a threshold, 200 centimorgans. And in general, the more centimorgans you share with someone, the more closely they're related to you. But again, more than 200 centimorgans is a good number if you're on the search for an unknown parent or grandparent. This starts to show how it all works. So this is a family tree, and it starts to show the basics of how DNA really drives our search for the answer to the question. The case of this tree is, who was my unknown father? So on this slide, the person at the bottom right is you, if you're the one looking for that unknown biological father, and then that father is indicated with the question mark. And you can see there's a segment of DNA on that shape that represents you in this family tree. The ancestors above are all blank because we don't have a clue who they were. We don't have a clue yet. But we're going to see that you inherited that segment of DNA from your unknown parent. And here's how this all works. On the bottom left of this family tree, you have a genetic match. And this is a person who showed up on your match list at maybe 100 centimorgans. But as it turns out, they've got a really good tree on Ancestry that goes back to their second great-grandparents, shown at the top of this tree. Once you know that, you can determine the reason you share 100 centimorgans of DNA with that person is probably because they're your third cousin and you share the same set of great-grandparents with them. So what's your next step if you're not looking for your second great-grandparents, you're looking for an unknown father? Well, the next step is if you can trace all the children that that couple at the top of this tree had, and then trace all those children's children, by building a family tree with just those two generations, you will have identified one of your unknown father's grandparents. Now, you won't have identified them immediately, but basically by creating the family tree down from those possible second great-grandparents, you will have included them in that tree by building their tree down to that level. And that gets you incredibly close to solving that question, who was my unknown biological father? So the previous example gets us to the second foundation, and that is understanding the term most recent common ancestors. And you'll see this abbreviated as MRCAs, and some people will pronounce that as a word, MERCAs. So by using information from the family trees of your genetic cousins, those are your DNA matches, you can establish various lines above the unknown person in your tree. Those family lines that you build out from the matches tree will identify the most recent common ancestor that you share with those matches. So once you have that information, you can build those trees down and then you start to get closer to identifying the person you're looking for. The other cool thing about going through this process to identify most recent common ancestors is that by identifying them, you're probably identifying your own ancestors on a line that you didn't know you had. So although in these early stages of the search, you still won't have an identity for the person or grandparent you're looking for, you'll probably have identified some great-great-grandparents that you can find out more about. And the final foundation before we start to look at techniques is to be systematic. It's definitely easy to get overwhelmed with this process. Most of us are not scientists or geneticists, and with all the new terminology and techniques that you learn as you go through this process, and with the very technical nature of DNA research, it is easy to get overwhelmed. Fortunately, everything we'll be looking at today can be boiled down basically to two steps. Those steps are available on the DNA adoption website, which also includes support information if you are an adoptee, for example, who's looking for an unknown parent, because that's as important as going through the technical process of identifying an unknown parent, is understanding how to reach out to people and how to reach out to any new family that you may find. Incidentally, the method that DNA adoption developed was updated and it was refined by a genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter. She's well known as the person who led the team that used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect in the Golden State Killer case in California. She also wrote a book last year called I Know Who You Are, and it's an excellent read if you're interested in the field of genetic genealogy, and in particular, that law enforcement branch known as investigative genetic genealogy. So being systematic, the system that you'll go through when you use DNA to identify an unknown parent or grandparent really boils down to just two steps, expanded as three in this slide. The steps are part of a longer method developed for adoptees on the DNA adoption site. So from their methodology, the steps of interest to us are their step number 6, which is identifying most recent common ancestors, which we just looked at. And you want to identify most recent common ancestors that link several of your matches together. And the key here is several. We talk about several genetic matches or cousins that we can link to a common ancestor as a cluster. So this is clustering is step 6. There's step 7 is, again, we looked at this as a foundation. Once we've identified most recent common ancestors, we build their trees forward in time by finding and recording and putting onto a family tree the descendants of those most recent common ancestors. And then their step 8 really kind of gets us to what I was saying about this being a 2-step process, which is simply repeating those first 2 steps for other clusters that we find in our match lists as we work to identify the unknown parent or grandparent. So the 2-step process and being systematic really comes down to identifying those most recent common ancestors and building their trees forward. And that gets us to the 3 techniques I wanted to share with you today. And as I go through the techniques, I'll also provide some examples from my own work to demonstrate how these techniques can help. So the first technique is to upload your DNA file from whatever company you decided to test with to all other family DNA sites that allow you to upload that file to their site. The point here is to cast as wide a net as possible to find as many genetic cousins and family trees that will help in your search. I mentioned Barbara Ray Venter's book a few minutes ago. In her book, she refers to this process as fishing in all ponds. So as you can see by this chart, if you test with Ancestry DNA, for example, which has about 25 million users, but you don't upload your Ancestry DNA file to MyHeritage, which may have as many as 8 million users, you're missing out on potentially close and very helpful matches. The 2 biggest consumer DNA companies, Ancestry and 23andMe, they currently don't permit you to upload a DNA file from another company to their site. So for now, your best strategy, if you haven't tested, is to test an Ancestry DNA and then upload that file to other companies on this chart. So MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, and GEDmatch. Those are the ones that allow uploading. 23andMe is more focused on what your DNA can tell you about your health rather than family history. So they don't have as robust a system for creating a family tree on their site. But if you have money for 2 tests, I would definitely recommend Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. And then you'll have the files you need to also upload to those other sites to find additional matches. That's the main reason for uploading your DNA file to the other sites, is to increase the pool of candidates and matches that you'll find. But it's also a good strategy because all these other companies offer different tools, which I'm not going to get into. The DNA matches on MyHeritage session that's coming up in this series can tell you more about that on the MyHeritage site. But most use a messaging system that's specific to their site. They'll have various tools available for analyzing your DNA matches so that you can find out more about them. I especially like Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch because they provide people's email addresses to contact matches rather than an internal messaging system. I do find that if you have someone's email address, you're a little more likely to get a response. And also some matches will be on multiple sites, so there are duplicates across these sites, but some of those people, many of those people will only maintain a family tree on one site. And their trees are almost as important as the DNA they share with you when you're doing this type of work. So this strategy also ensures you have access to as many family trees as possible, not just matches. The file that you're going to transfer from one site to another to increase the number of matches that you have is called a raw DNA file, but it's just a text file that's simply full of letters and numbers that represent the pattern in your DNA. And to do this, to get onto other sites, it's a two-step process. First, I have instructions on the handout, but you can just Google raw DNA download and the name of the company that you tested with, and you'll get to the instructions needed to download your DNA file from that site where you paid for your DNA test, and then save it to your computer. Then you can just Google raw DNA upload and the name of a company you want to upload to, and then follow those instructions, and also create an account on that other site, and then upload your DNA file to that other site. When you do that as well, the other sites, because you didn't test with them, it is free to upload to other sites, but there will be what they call a one-time unlock fee, which could be $10, $20, or $40, depending on the site. Well worth spending that, because it does give you access to tools on their site that you'll need in order to do the work you have to do with the DNA matches. It is a one-time fee. There are no hidden costs. Once you've paid that, then you have access to all the tools. So here's a very clear example from my experience about uploading your DNA file to all sites. In this case, the person who took a DNA test wanted to identify their unknown biological father. So they tested on Ancestry, and that's where they were working away at identifying most recent common ancestors among clusters of their genetic matches. In this case, they were all matches who shared less than 200 centimorgans of DNA. So they were about third cousins. And it was possible to identify their unknown father by using those matches and their family trees. But it was also time consuming, because third cousins meant having to go back about 4 generations on a family tree and then building that tree down with all of those descendants. And so that's a lot of descendants to identify and track. But a match with a nearer relative, like a half sibling, certainly, or a first cousin in particular, would have made things easier and quicker. So in this case, they actually had not uploaded their Ancestry DNA file to other sites, including MyHeritage. And this is a screenshot from MyHeritage. Now, in this case, the person's father was likely British, ethnically British. And MyHeritage is well known in the genealogy community for having a higher percentage of British and European test takers than, say, Ancestry. So after downloading their file from Ancestry and then uploading it to MyHeritage and waiting for a few days for the file to process, the first person at the top of their match list was a first cousin. There were other ways to identify that it, in fact, was a paternal first cousin. They were living in the United Kingdom. It was the breakthrough moment that we were looking for, and I'll show you why in a minute. So with this first cousin, it took about an hour to solve the case, whereas with only the Ancestry DNA matches, it's still possible, but it would have taken many weeks. So the first cousin match is incredibly useful if you're looking for a parent, because, or in this case, it was an unknown father, because if you look at that cousin's tree, they match you, they have their tree on Ancestry. In this case, we looked at that cousin's tree and they only had, if they only had one uncle, you would be done, because that uncle would be the father that you were looking for. And then traditional research takes over, and then you need to work with records and dates and locations to see if you can corroborate what the DNA is telling you. I've changed some details in this family tree here to keep everything anonymous, but to provide it as an example. So in this case, that first cousin on MyHeritage actually had 3 uncles. But again, the DNA work was done, And the traditional research then took over to determine, well, which uncle was the most likely candidate to be the unknown father. First of all, it was not the cousin's father who was the unknown father, because if that was the case, the DNA would have told us that they were half siblings or siblings and not first cousins. So the match's father could be ruled out. One of their uncles could be ruled out because he was living in another location from where we knew the test takers had been conceived and born. That was actually the case for another one of the cousin's uncles as well. And that really only left one person who became our prime candidate. And so again, it became a search for records and dates and locations to determine where that man was at the right time. And that's where everything kind of fell into place with the record search to indicate that, yes, he was in the right place at the right time to have conceived the person who was the test taker looking for their unknown father. So the second technique, once you've got your DNA file uploaded to multiple sites, is to bring some order to the chaos of your match list. And the technique here, and I touched on it in the foundations, is to identify clusters of matches. So those are basically sets of cousins within your match list that they match each other and you. And if they have family trees, you can build their family trees to determine who their most recent ancestor is, because the person you're looking for will be in that tree somewhere. So one way to do this, and the way Ancestry uses in their shared matches tool, which I'm showing here on the screen, is to identify groups of people who are all shared matches with each other and you, and who, in Ancestry's case, they share more than 20 centimorgans of DNA to be shown as a shared match. 20 centimorgans is not really very much. And as we saw with the first cousins, something around 1,000 is certainly incredibly useful. 200 is useful. But these matches over 20 can also be very useful if you know that they match each other. So you might remember, you can look back at the method that I talked about from DNA adoption. And we looked at the technique that they outlined, which was really a two-step process. The first is what I'm showing here, which is identifying clusters of matches, and then identify the most recent common ancestors that link them. Where did they all get their DNA from? They all shared DNA in common, so they all inherited it from common ancestors. So finding out who they were is really important. So shared matches on Ancestry is one way to identify clusters of people that you can then start to work with as far as building their trees back to a common ancestor. Another way to identify clusters of matches who are all related to each other, they're all cousins from a common ancestor, is a method called the Leeds method, L-E-E-D-S. That's named after Dana Leeds, a genealogist, mentioned in my handout. So you can Google Leeds method. And if you're using Ancestry, you can use that Leeds method and Ancestry's colored dots to have fun with the colored dots, using that as a way to identify clusters of genetic cousins. MyHeritage also has a clustering tool that does some of the work automatically for you. It's also very cool, and it runs a report and gives you a graph and then shows you blocks of people who are all related to each other. So once you've clustered your matches and you have identified that they're on the side of the parent that you're looking for, or grandparent, then the next step is to examine their trees. Or you might have to use their trees and then do more research on their family lines if they haven't done very much. But the goal here is always to cluster the matches and build their family trees to identify the ancestors they have in common, because that's where that shared DNA came from. And that's what's going to point to your common ancestors with them as well. So once you identify most recent common ancestors who link those clusters of matches, you can start building down from those most recent common ancestors and trace all of their descendants. Because one of their descendants, as I've mentioned, is probably going to be one of the person that you're looking for. So once you get to this stage, once again, you've built that tree down, the DNA work is done. And now it's back to traditional genealogy and searching records to build a complete and accurate tree. Sometimes when you're doing this tree building, there are clues that can help focus your time and research on a particular line. So you might not have to build a tree with every single one of the descendants of an identified set of a couple of most recent common ancestors. So this is an example of someone who was looking for their birth father. They had found a surname that kept popping up in the trees of one of their clusters of matches. So finding that surname that keeps popping up in a cluster of shared matches is what tends to point you in the right direction towards the ancestor that links all those matches together and makes them related. And fortunately, in this case, it was a somewhat unusual surname. And the most recent common ancestors, it turns out, were a married couple who lived in the eastern part of North America in the mid to late 1800s. That couple had 12 children. They had one girl, and then they had 9 sons, and then they had 2 more girls. And all of them lived to adulthood, and all of them married, and all of them had children. So building out this tree from just that information would have been an incredible amount of work. Only 6 of those children are shown in this slide, in this example, but it would have been too much work. If you really wanted the answer, that work would have had to have been done. But fortunately, and this is what can happen when you do this research, there was a big clue that helped focus all of that tree building work. One of those 9 sons left the area where the family had lived for a couple of generations, and he moved out west. And the person who was looking for their birth father was also born out west. So that seemed like a very likely line to focus on to start with, rather than building an entire tree. And it also became apparent that the closest genetic matches, so the people who shared the most DNA with the person who was looking for their birth father, were descendants of that particular line of that son who had migrated out of the ancestral area. So in the end, this led to a set of 3 brothers. And just like in the last example, it was then a matter of researching their lives and going through a process of elimination to come up with the most likely candidate, who was this person's birth father. So we've looked at the hard work of identifying clusters of matches, and then the second part, identifying their most recent common ancestors and building their family trees. And we also looked at the value of uploading your DNA file to multiple sites to find the best and closest matches possible, because that best and closest match might be on a site that you didn't test at, but they did. So this last technique is where we get to just kind of jump right in and fast track our search for an unidentified parent or grandparent. This is where you get to theorize immediately. If you have a match that shares a significant amount of DNA with you, and if they have a good family tree, or if you can build a good family tree for them, this is where you can theorize immediately. So if you have matches that are greater than, say, let's go back to that 200 to Morgan threshold, and if you've determined that they're on the tree right away, you can figure out exactly how they're related to you. And then the tree that you've created by doing that can start to point directly to the person you're looking for. So when you have matches who share above 200 centimorgans, that makes it possible to determine very specifically how those people may be related to you. And to do that, you use a tool online called the Shared CM Project Tool. And in that tool, you enter the amount of DNA that you share with someone, and it will give you a range of relationships that are possible. So in the example here, the amount of shared DNA, someone I was working with had a match who was shared 252 centimorgans with them. And according to the Shared CM or Shared Centimorgan Project Tool, there's a 65% chance that that person is related to you through your unknown parent or grandparent in only one of 5 ways. So according to this tool, that 252 centimorgan match could be your half great grand aunt or uncle. They could be your second cousin. They could be your half first cousin once removed. They could be your first cousin twice removed, or they could be your half great grand niece or nephew. Now, that might sound like a lot of confusing possibilities, but again, a process of elimination can really help here. If you know from their family tree that that match is older than you by maybe a couple of decades, then they're likely one generation removed from you. They're one generation closer to your most recent common ancestor. So that alone only leaves one good possibility from this chart, which is that they are your half first cousin once removed. So this is what I mean by just jumping right in and theorizing immediately. And let's have a look at how this played out in real life. So here's the final example for today. In this case, theorizing immediately meant creating this very simple tree. In this case, the person on the bottom right of the tree, Graham, knew who his father was, and that's Cornelius above him. And he also knew who his grandfather was, and that's Thomas. But he wanted to know who his great-grandfather was, and that's Thomas's father, indicated by a question mark at the top of the tree. So that part of the tree was very quick to construct. The test taker, his father, his grandfather, his known great-grandmother, who was a single woman, who had his grandfather, and then a question mark for his unknown great-grandfather. What allowed us to theorize immediately in this case was the fact that Graham had a 252 centimorgan match to Beatrice over on the left. He also had a fair-sized match to Holly, who was Beatrice's first cousin. So in this case, Beatrice was on Ancestry, Holly was on MyHeritage, and Graham found them both because he had uploaded his ancestry to all possible sites. Beatrice and Holly created basically a small cluster that he could identify, a cluster of 2 first cousins, and he identified their Merkas, or most recent common ancestors, which were their grandparents. So all we needed to solve this case was the 252 centimorgans of DNA that Graham shared with Beatrice. The first step was to go to the Shared CM Project tool to see possible relationships, which we looked at in the last slide. And in this case, we knew from Beatrice and Holly's family tree, maintained by Linda down there at the bottom left, that they were about 30 years older than Graham. So that indicated that whatever their relationship was between Graham and Beatrice, it was most likely a one generation removed relationship. So that means there was one more generation between Graham and the most recent and common ancestor that he shared with Beatrice and Holly. So going back to the Shared CM Project tool, the only good possibility from all of those at first confusing possibilities was that Beatrice and Holly were Graham's half first cousins once removed, because it was the only relationship at the top of those possibilities that described a half relationship. So full cousins share one set of grandparents, like Beatrice and Holly, but half cousins only share one grandparent. Either they have a grandfather in common or a grandmother in common. And in this case, we knew it was a man we were looking for, not a woman, because up there on the top right, we knew who Graham's great-grandmother was. And we knew she was a single woman when she had her son, Thomas. So it really came down to the fact that the man we were looking for was Beatrice and Holly's grandfather. So that man created the half relationship here by fathering a child, Thomas, over on the right, outside his marriage. The family he had in his marriage is represented by the side of the tree on the left. So in this case, by theorizing immediately, using an amount of shared DNA and the possible relationships, we were able to complete the search very quickly. And it didn't involve a lot of tree building or a lot of time tracing a lot of descendants. Also, in this last example, we included all three techniques we looked at today. Graham had uploaded his DNA file to multiple sites, in this case, Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, GEDmatch, and Family Tree DNA. And it involved identifying a cluster. In this case, the cluster was nice and small. It was just two first cousins who shared DNA with each other and with Graham. So it was easy to trace Beatrice and Holly's family line to identify their most recent common ancestors, which was simply a single set of grandparents. And then the size of the match allowed us to theorize immediately and to identify a likely relationship and then create a quick tree. And at that point, it was really just a fill in the blank, which was the unknown man at the top of the tree who fathered two families, one with his wife, one on the right, Graham's family line. So as a quick review, before we get into questions, here's what we looked at today. There are some foundations that are very important to understand when you're using DNA to identify an unknown parent or grandparent. Knowing a bit about DNA inheritance, the importance of identifying clusters of matching cousins, and then determining their most recent common ancestors. And then to keep your wits about you, having a system to kind of hold on to or go back to really focus your efforts. And then the three techniques for success we looked at today are definitely use all available DNA websites, cluster your matches and build their trees, and especially if you have matches who share enough DNA, theorize immediately to really cut to the chase, and you might find the answer you're looking for. So thanks very much for attending this presentation, and I'm definitely looking forward to your questions.
This first one is from Linda, and she says, and I don't know if you know the answer to this. I don't know the answer to this. 23andMe has stopped allowing matches in common because of a security issue. Do you know if they have plans to resume that?
I don't know if they have plans to resume that. I would assume they would, because it's an important part of any DNA family site that people would feel that they're paying for when they do sign up, and it would have been what people expected when they purchased those products. So I don't know for sure, but I would absolutely imagine yes.
Yeah, I do too. We just don't have a timeline. I think they've said something like temporarily disabled this function or something like that, which leads me to believe that they will re-enable it at some point in the future. She says, and I'm quoting her, "I'm old, but most of my matches are younger. I want to confirm my second great-grandfather. Does this mean that the younger matches are more removed, not third cousins?"
Yeah, as the generations proceed and as people get younger and the testers get younger, they've got smaller and smaller pieces of DNA that they've inherited from the ancestors that we're hoping to identify. So that work is still possible with those smaller matches. It's just that basically it means a lot more tree building and sifting through a lot more possibilities. But it can be done, but it may take some assistance and a lot of time.
Connie says, will this methodology work for finding a missing great-grandfather?
Yes, absolutely. So the last example we looked at, Graham was actually, he identified his great-grandfather in this way.
Now I have some more kind of stumpers. I have somebody who says, I'm looking for a Puerto Rican father for a client, huge endogamy in the family tree. Can you advise on how to handle this?
I can't. But what I can say is that there are a lot of good resources out there about sifting through endogamous relationships. So I haven't had to work with those cases, but my first step would be to educate myself and understand what's possible. Leah Larkin is a genealogist and blogger who has the DNA Geek blog, and her latest blog post is about an interesting case of endogamy that might even be a springboard to more information for you. But definitely, yes, it's a special field of interest, and there are specialists in it.
I would say perhaps go to DNA Detective's Facebook page if you haven't gone there, if you're interested in, if you do Facebook, and post that you need someone who maybe has some experience with Puerto Rican endogamy, and you might come up with somebody on that Facebook page that says, oh yeah, that's exactly what I do, and they might be able to assess that kind of thing. Somebody wants you to go into a little bit more about your Jewish example. She's saying, I'm a search angel and have solved many adoptive and NPE cases. I'm currently working one for a 79-year-old man seeking his father. He came up as 13 to 18% Ashkenazi Jewish. Now the problem is tracking down the Ashkenazi Jewish DNA. Do you have any suggestions for her or anything more you can elaborate on that?
So the last example I gave of Graham finding his great-grandparent was actually the most recent Jewish case, a Jewish case, and that involved it depends where that person lived and in what period of time. In this case, that person lived in an English-speaking environment and the records were in English. So it was possible to verify what the DNA was telling us with the records we needed to prove it. But if somebody is from somewhere else without those English language records, if you don't have a specialty in it or a place that's missing records, that could be harder. But I guess what I want to say is DNA is DNA, so you can use it across the board no matter what to do this work. The question just becomes, are the matches out there that will give you the information you need? But that percentage, if that percentage came from one person, that's probably a great grandparent. And again, just knowing that might help determine where that person is in your family tree. Is there a gap? And then that might help you with a location if you can identify where that gap is in that person's pedigree at that level of great-grandparent.
James asked, what is the best approach when you have multiple matches who do not have a family tree or a minimal family tree?
If they share enough DNA with you that you can identify that they're part of a cluster, then you can kind of set them aside and look at that cluster for anyone who does have a tree and start with the people who do have trees. If this is someone who you can't put into a cluster and you're just, if they're a high match and you can't put them into a cluster, then do they have an unusual name? Can you Google them? You just kind of start to think of how else could you identify like who they are and then who their tree might be if they're not answering you. But if they're part of a shared match cluster, which is really what you want to be working with in any case, then other matches in that cluster may have trees that will help.
Vicky says, when uploading from Ancestry to MyHeritage and Family Tree, is there a need to get the paid access?
No, MyHeritage can be confusing because it seems like you have to buy a subscription, but the subscription on MyHeritage is for their records set. It has nothing to do with your DNA being uploaded. So MyHeritage, I think their one-time unlock fee is, I think it's $49 right now, but it's around that amount. So that's the only thing you should expect to pay on MyHeritage. But they do send lots of emails, and it's hard to find the setting to turn their emails off. It can be done, but no, you're not paying all over again for subscriptions, just a low one-time fee.
I have a parent who was adopted, and it turns out her biological grandfather was himself adopted. Any suggestions for how to handle like double adoptions in the family?
If you don't know who a parent is, on that family tree that you start out with, it's always a blank, and the person above them is always a blank. So no matter who their parents were, they're going to be blanks anyway, and you're going to follow the DNA to who they were. So I guess the only thing I would say in that case is to focus on the grandparent. It's the same technique is what I will say. The technique that I provided is the technique that you would use no matter the adoptions or who they were.
I would say if you're not doing this, you should also be, if these are recent adoptions, let's say 20th century or more recent, you may have a chance of ordering adoption records from the state or the from the placing in whatever country the adoption happened in. So look into if you can actually access the adoption records, because that's going to give you your best clues. If you actually can get a hold of those, then you may not have to be plunging through all this kind of distant DNA matches to try to figure this out if you're already able to access the adoption records.
And I would also say DNA, if you haven't looked at the DNA adoption website, then go to the DNA adoption website, and they in fact might be able to help you.
Which sites have the best cluster tools?
So Ancestry is very good, but Ancestry won't show you in a technical way if the people in their clusters of shared matches. So on Ancestry, they call clusters shared matches. But what Ancestry won't show you is if all of those shared matches are shared because they have an identical segment or segments of DNA. It has to be identical segments of DNA to indicate that they all share a common ancestor. So then that gets us over to MyHeritage or Family Tree DNA, because they have a tool called a chromosome browser. And it's a chromosome browser where you can look at your DNA and you can actually kind of look at the pattern of their DNA, and it'll tell you if they overlap and are the same piece of DNA. And if it's the same piece of DNA, that's what's coming from those most recent common ancestors that you need to identify. So Ancestry does a good job, but when it gets right down to it, you need to be able to see where that you're matching those people on your chromosomes. So MyHeritage is better for that. GEDmatch, absolutely. Family Tree DNA, but you don't have the number of people that you do on Ancestry. So often what it's a case of is finding people on Ancestry, they become interesting to you, you ask if they will upload to GEDmatch or MyHeritage to then use that tool that I didn't mention in the presentation, but a chromosome browser is very useful for this work.
We're not going to be able to get to all these questions. We've gotten a lot of them. Somebody named Katrina has an interesting one here. I have 3 first cousin matches I don't know. They are all easily identifiable as coming from my mom's side. I just can't determine which of her 10 siblings parented each of them. I have asked other first cousins how they match each of these 3 unknown, but none claims to have them as a half sibling match. Is there any way to find out whose children these matches are?
Yeah. So all cases are different. And when you've got that many first cousins, some of them might be on some of the other sites that make it perhaps easier to figure out what the relationships are. If they're all on Ancestry and they don't have trees, I don't know what your next step would be, but I don't know. I feel like I'd have to kind of, I don't want to say much without actually looking at what's going on there. Yeah, some people aren't saying possibly what they might know. Perhaps.
Yeah. I would say maybe if you have good relations with these cousins, go over to their house sometime and just kind of say, hey, let's log into your DNA and kind of see if they'll show you their DNA, and you can get the information yourself of how they're matching these unknown people. And at least there would be that. But it sounds like you've got 3 cousins that have, or some cousins that have tested, but maybe not from all 10 of your mom's siblings. So that would be the key, is to try to get a cousin from each of the siblings to test if you can.
And then traditional genealogy, determining where your mother's siblings were in time.
Yeah, the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Okay, we're gonna do one more and then we're going to have to stop this, even though we're having a great time.
We are.
We've just got too many.
Okay.
This is kind of the same thing, but it's a little different. If you've narrowed a mystery grandfather down to a specific family, I assume she means she knows the parents of the mystery grandfather. Would you ever be able to discern which of the brothers in that family was the actual grandfather?
Right. So that's kind of like, in a way, a couple of examples that I showed.
Mhm.
And depending on what other matches are out there, you might be able to determine if any of those brothers had other descendants and what your match is to them, to those descendants. But this is again where I think traditional genealogy takes over is you've got your candidate pool and you're kind of done with the DNA. And now it's a question of looking at traditional records to determine, like Sarah said, right place at the right time. Where were those three brothers at different times? And that's exactly the case I had that I handed off to the person I helped, which was here's the three brothers. And then she kind of took over and started reaching out and making phone calls and determining what their personal histories were as to who was most likely.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike. This was very good. And I believe Mike has said he will be happy if you'd email him with some of
Yeah,
your questions if we didn't get to them. And we're also happy for you to email us at genealogy@acpl.info. I am kind of a DNA expert here at the library myself. So between the two of us, I think we can probably get to some of your other questions if you want to send them to us. So thanks again, Mike, and we'll see you all again Thursday night at 6:30 for our next program.
thanks very much.